Alice, I finally got it. David's voice burst through my phone speaker as I was organizing files in our home office in Phoenix, Arizona. The raise, $25,000 more per year, plus the corner office. After 3 years of grinding, Ms. Johnson finally recognized my potential. My heart soared as I dropped the papers I was holding. My name is Alice Thompson. I'm 39 years old, and I work as a senior accountant for a mid-sized manufacturing firm. For what felt like forever, I had watched my husband David pour everything into Silverwick Partners, staying late every night, working weekends, sacrificing our time together for the promise of advancement that his boss, Ms. Victoria Johnson, kept dangling just out of reach. David, that's incredible. I'm so proud of you, I exclaimed, feeling genuine joy bubble up inside me. This promotion represented everything we had worked toward. The financial security we needed to start a family, the stability to buy a real house instead of renting this cramped apartment. I can't believe it's finally happening, David continued, his voice thick with emotion. Johnson just called me into her office and told me the board approved everything. I start the new position Monday, but I'm staying late tonight to finalize some transition paperwork with her. As I listened to David's excitement, my mind was already racing with celebration plans. This called for something special, not just takeout Chinese food or a bottle of wine from the corner store. This was the moment we had been sacrificing for, the breakthrough that would change our entire future. How late will you be working? I asked, glancing at the clock. It was already 6 p.m. Probably another 2 hours. Johnson wants to go over all the new responsibilities in detail. You know how thorough she is about these transitions. After we hung up, I stood in our kitchen, overwhelmed with happiness and relief. All those nights of eating dinner alone while David worked late. All those times I had to attend social events by myself because he was putting in extra hours. All those moments when I wondered if his dedication would ever pay off. It had all been worth it. But this news deserved more than just a phone conversation. David had worked so hard for this moment, and I wanted to share in his triumph properly. I decided to surprise him with his favorite meal delivered right to his office. We could celebrate together, maybe even christen that new corner office he had mentioned. I opened the refrigerator and pulled out the salmon fillets I had been saving for a special occasion. David loved my grilled salmon with herb butter, and tonight seemed like the perfect time to prepare it. As I gathered ingredients, I imagined his face when I walked into his office with a home-cooked celebration dinner. He would be so surprised, so touched that I had gone to this effort. As I prepared the salmon, my mind wandered to our journey together. David and I met during our senior year at Arizona State University, both studying business with dreams of climbing the corporate ladder. He was charming and ambitious, always talking about the life we would build together once we graduated and found our footing in the professional world. When David landed the position at Silverwick Partners 3 years ago, we thought it was our golden ticket. The company specialized in financial consulting for mid-sized businesses, and David started in their analysis department under the direct supervision of Ms. Victoria Johnson. She was in her mid-40s, recently divorced, and according to David, brilliant at navigating corporate politics. From the beginning, David spoke constantly about Ms. Johnson's mentorship. She stayed late to train him, invited him to important client meetings, and promised to help him advance within the company. I was grateful that David had found such a supportive boss. The business world could be ruthless, and having an advocate seemed like a blessing. But over the past year, I had noticed subtle changes in David's behavior. He became more secretive about work conversations, more defensive when I asked about office dynamics. When I suggested we invite Ms. Johnson for dinner to thank her for her support, David always found excuses to avoid it. There were other small things too. New cologne that I hadn't bought him. Late-night text messages that he quickly deleted. A sudden interest in expensive clothing that stretched our budget. When I questioned these changes, David always had reasonable explanations. Professional image mattered for advancement. Networking required constant communication. Success demanded certain standards. I pushed my concerns aside, attributing them to the stress we were both under as he worked toward this promotion. The salmon sizzled in the pan, filling our small apartment with rich, savory aromas. I prepared his favorite herb butter, a mixture of fresh dill, garlic, and lemon that he always said reminded him of our honeymoon in Seattle. As I carefully arranged everything in our good containers, I felt a surge of pride in our partnership. We had made sacrifices, but they were paying off. I changed into a nice dress, the blue one David always complimented, and touched up my makeup. This surprise visit would be the perfect way to mark this milestone in our marriage. Maybe we could even go out for drinks afterward to celebrate properly. The drive to Silverwick Partners took me through downtown Phoenix's business district, past the gleaming office towers where successful people built their careers. Tonight, David was joining their ranks. Tonight, all our patience and hard work was finally being rewarded. As I parked in the underground garage and gathered the warm dinner containers, I felt a flutter of excitement. David would be so surprised to see me, so touched by this gesture. We could finally start planning for the future we had always talked about. The house, the children, the financial security that had seemed so elusive just hours ago. The lobby of Silverwick Partners was mostly empty at this hour, with only the security guard and a few scattered employees working late. I signed in at the front desk and took the elevator to the 15th floor, where David's department was located. The building felt different in the evening, quieter, more intimate somehow. Perfect for a private celebration between husband and wife. The 15th floor was dimly lit, with most offices dark and empty. I walked past David's usual cubicle, which would soon be his former workspace, toward what I assumed would be his new corner office. My heels clicked softly against the polished floor as I imagined his reaction to my surprise. I approached the reception area where Claire, David's young assistant, was still at her desk. She was in her mid-20s, always bubbly and energetic during the few times I had visited the office. When she saw me approaching with the dinner containers, her face lit up with what seemed like barely contained excitement. "Oh, Mrs. Thompson," Claire exclaimed, her voice bright with surprise. "What brings you here so late?" "I wanted to surprise David with a celebration dinner for his promotion," I explained, holding up the containers. "He just called with the wonderful news about his raise in the corner office." Claire's expression shifted slightly, and she glanced toward the hallway with an odd smile. "Oh, how sweet of you. He's actually in the main conference room right now with Ms. Johnson. They're going over his new position in detail. You know how thorough she is about these transitions." "Of course," I nodded, feeling my excitement build. "I don't want to interrupt anything important." "Which conference room?" "The big one at the end of the executive hall," Claire said, pointing down the corridor. "The one with the beautiful city view. I'm sure they won't mind a quick interruption for such good news." I thanked Claire and headed down the hallway, carefully balancing the warm containers. It made perfect sense that David and Ms. Johnson would be finalizing the details of his promotion in the company's most impressive conference room. I imagined walking in to find them reviewing organizational charts and discussing David's new responsibilities. As I approached the conference room, I could see light spilling from under the door. I heard muffled voices inside, though I couldn't make out the words. Not wanting to interrupt what might be an important strategic discussion, I decided to peek in first to gauge whether this was an appropriate time for my surprise. I gently turned the handle and pushed the door open just a crack, ready to catch David's eye and gesture with the dinner containers. But what I saw through that small opening made my blood turn to ice. David was pressed against the conference table, his shirt unbuttoned and tie loosened, locked in a passionate embrace with Ms. Johnson. Her hands were tangled in his hair, his arms wrapped around her waist, their bodies moving together with the familiarity of practiced lovers. This wasn't a congratulatory hug between colleagues. This was the intimate embrace of two people who had been deceiving me for months, possibly years. Time stopped as I stood frozen in that doorway, the warm dinner containers suddenly feeling like lead weights in my hands. My husband of 8 years was betraying everything we had built together, and I was watching it happen in real time. The herb butter salmon I had prepared with such love and excitement felt like a cruel joke, a symbol of my own naivety. I carefully, silently pulled the door closed and stepped back into the hallway. My legs felt unsteady, but my mind was surprisingly clear. The promotion hadn't been about David's hard work or professional merit. It had been payment for services rendered. Ms. Johnson hadn't been mentoring him professionally. She had been grooming him personally, and I had been too trusting to see it. Every late night, every weekend conference call, every defensive reaction when I asked about work, it all crystallized into devastating clarity. David's new cologne, his secretive text messages, his sudden interest in expensive clothes, none of it had been about professional advancement. It had all been about impressing another woman while lying to his wife. I walked back toward the elevator, my footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. As I passed Claire's desk, she looked up with that same bright expression, and suddenly, I understood the barely contained amusement I had seen in her eyes. She knew about the affair. Of course she knew. She probably helped schedule their private meetings, maybe even covered for them when colleagues asked questions. "Did you find them?" Claire asked with false innocence, but I could hear the malicious satisfaction in her voice now. "Yes," I managed to say, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. They were very focused on his new position. In the elevator, I leaned against the wall and closed my eyes, trying to process what I had witnessed. The worst part wasn't just the physical betrayal. It was the systematic deception. David had used my support, my sacrifices, my unwavering belief in his integrity to build a relationship with his boss. He had let me celebrate his success while knowing it was built on adultery. My phone buzzed with a text from David. "Working late on transition details with Johnson. Don't wait up. Thanks for being so understanding about my career demands. Love you." The audacity of the message sent a surge of cold fury through me. He was literally in that woman's arms while texting me about love and understanding. But instead of responding with emotion, I felt something else rising within me. A calculating anger that surprised me with its clarity. I drove home in silence, my accountant's mind already shifting into analytical mode. If David wanted to play games with our marriage, I needed to protect myself financially. Within an hour of arriving home, I had quietly transferred the majority of our joint savings into my personal account, money I had contributed equally over the years. I changed passwords on our shared credit cards and put fraud alerts on our accounts. But as I worked through these protective measures, my professional instincts began noticing patterns that troubled me. David's recent raises and bonuses seemed unusually generous for someone at his level in the company. Ms. Johnson's authority to approve such significant compensation adjustments raised questions about proper corporate oversight and financial controls. I opened David's laptop. He had always been careless about security, and found his work email still logged in. What I discovered there went far beyond a simple office affair. Email after email revealed not just their personal relationship, but evidence of financial irregularities that made my blood run cold. Ms. Johnson had been systematically manipulating David's performance reviews and approving unauthorized bonuses, but more disturbing were the communications about employee pension fund investments. She had been redirecting pension contributions into high-risk investments through companies she controlled, and when those investments failed, she was covering the losses with money from other corporate accounts. David's promotion wasn't just payment for their affair. It was hush money to keep him quiet about missing pension funds that belonged to hard-working employees planning their retirements. Over the next 3 days, I maintained a careful facade of normalcy while conducting my own investigation. David returned home that night, full of excitement about his promotion, spinning elaborate stories about the detailed strategy session with Ms. Johnson. I listened with apparent enthusiasm, even congratulating him on his dedication finally paying off. "Johnson says this is just the beginning," David said over breakfast, completely oblivious to my discovery. "She believes I have executive potential. With her continued mentorship, I could be running my own division within 2 years." The word mentorship made my stomach turn, but I smiled and nodded supportively. "She certainly seems invested in your future," While David was at work, I reached out to Janet Winters, a former colleague who now worked with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. As a senior accountant, I had professional connections throughout Phoenix's business community, and Janet specialized in corporate fraud investigations. "Alice, it's wonderful to hear from you," Janet said when I called. "What can I do for you?" "I need confidential advice about potential financial irregularities," I said carefully. "If someone suspected that company resources were being misused for personal relationships, what kind of documentation would be needed for investigation?" Janet's tone became more serious. "That could constitute several federal crimes: embezzlement, conspiracy, breach of fiduciary duty. The key would be proving systematic misuse of corporate assets. Are you seeing irregularities at your firm?" "Not my firm, my husband's company. I have reason to believe there are serious financial improprieties involving pension fund management." "Alice, if you're talking about pension fund fraud, that's extremely serious. Federal prosecutors take retirement security violations very seriously. Do you have access to documentation?" That evening, while David was supposedly working late again, I conducted a thorough examination of his computer files. The evidence I found exceeded my worst fears. David and Ms. Johnson hadn't just been having an affair, they had been systematically stealing from employee retirement accounts. Ms. Johnson had diverted over $1.2 million from pension funds into shell companies she controlled. When those investments failed, she used money from operational accounts to cover the shortfalls, creating an increasingly complex web of financial deception that would eventually collapse and destroy dozens of employees' retirement security. The most damning evidence was a series of emails where David expressed concerns about the missing pension money, and Ms. Johnson's responses offering him financial incentives to remain quiet. Other messages revealed their plan to eventually frame several innocent employees for the financial irregularities when the scheme inevitably unraveled. My hands shook as I copied these files to a secure drive. This wasn't just adultery. It was federal fraud that would devastate the financial futures of people who had trusted their employer with their retirement savings. Some of these employees were in their 50s and 60s, depending on those pensions for basic survival after decades of loyal service. I spent the rest of the night creating a comprehensive documentation package that detailed every aspect of their criminal conspiracy. By dawn, I had built a case that would not only destroy their careers, but likely result in federal prison sentences. The next morning, I called Janet and requested an emergency meeting. We met at a discreet coffee shop downtown, where I presented the evidence I had gathered. Janet's expression grew increasingly grave as she reviewed the emails, financial transfers, and pension fund documentation. "Alice, this is massive," Janet said quietly. "We're looking at multiple federal charges: wire fraud, conspiracy, embezzlement, possibly RICO violations. How do you want to proceed?" "I want full prosecution," I said without hesitation. "But I also want to protect the employees whose retirement money has been stolen. They deserve to know their financial security is at risk." Working with Janet and the FBI's white-collar crime unit, I spent the following week building an airtight case while maintaining my facade of ignorant wife. Federal agents installed monitoring software to track any attempts David might make to delete evidence, and I continued recording conversations where he discussed work matters. The breakthrough came when David mentioned that Ms. Johnson was planning to transfer the remaining accessible pension funds to offshore accounts for better security and growth potential. This gave investigators the urgency they needed to act before the money disappeared permanently. "We're executing search warrants tomorrow morning," Janet informed me during our final coordination meeting. "Can you ensure David will be in the office around 10 a.m.? "He's always there by 8:30, I confirmed. He's been going in early to prepare for his new responsibilities. That final morning, I prepared David's favorite breakfast and even packed him a lunch, playing the role of supportive wife one last time. As he prepared to leave for what would be his last day of freedom, I kissed him goodbye, knowing this would be our final normal interaction. "Have a productive day, honey," I said, my voice steady. "I hope everything goes smoothly with your transition into the new role. Thanks, Alice. You've been so patient and supportive through this whole process. Johnson was right when she said I was lucky to have such an understanding wife. The irony of his words was almost overwhelming, but I managed to smile. I am sure Ms. Johnson has given you lots of valuable advice. 2 hours after David left, I received a text from Janet. Teams are moving into position. Thank you for your courage in exposing this fraud. Justice will be served today. I drove to Silverwick Partners and parked across the street, arriving just as FBI agents and financial crimes investigators were entering the building. Several news vans were already positioned outside. Janet had coordinated with media contacts to ensure public awareness of the pension fund theft. Through the building's glass lobby, I could see agents moving systematically through the offices with evidence boxes and computer equipment. Employees were gathering in confused clusters, their faces reflecting shock and concern as they realized something major was happening to their company. My phone rang. It was David. Alice, something terrible is happening. The FBI is here with search warrants, and they just arrested Johnson. They're asking me all kinds of questions about pension funds and financial transfers. I don't understand what's going on. I think you understand perfectly, I said calmly, watching through the windows as federal agents approached David's desk. The question is whether you're going to tell the truth or continue the lies. What are you talking about? Alice, you have to help me. They're treating me like a criminal. You are a criminal, David. You stole money from people's retirement accounts while lying to your wife. The FBI has all the evidence they need. Through the glass, I watched David's face go white as he processed my words. The phone slipped from his hand as federal agents approached with handcuffs. Mrs. Thompson. Agent Rodriguez, the lead investigator, had approached my car. We've secured both suspects and all the financial evidence. Your information was crucial to preventing further theft from those pension accounts. As I watched David being led away in handcuffs, his face a mask of shock and betrayal, I felt only cold satisfaction. This was the man who had promised to love and honor me, who had used my trust to facilitate crimes against innocent people. The arrests became front-page news across Phoenix within hours. Corporate executives arrested in million-dollar pension fraud dominated local television coverage, with reporters interviewing shocked Silverwick Partners employees who had just learned their retirement savings were at risk. I stood in the lobby of the federal building as David and Ms. Johnson were processed, watching through security glass as they were fingerprinted and photographed. David kept looking toward the entrance, still believing somehow that I would come to his rescue, that this was all a misunderstanding I could help resolve. Agent Rodriguez approached me with an update. Both suspects are being held without bail pending federal grand jury proceedings. The evidence you provided has enabled us to freeze all their assets and begin recovering the stolen pension funds. What about the employees? I asked. How much of their retirement money can be recovered? We've identified most of the diverted funds. Between asset seizures and federal insurance protections, we expect to recover approximately 90% of the stolen money. Your early intervention prevented a complete catastrophe. Through the glass, I watched Ms. Johnson arguing with her court-appointed attorney, her polished professional demeanor finally cracking under the weight of federal criminal charges. David sat slumped in a holding cell, still wearing the expensive shirt I had helped him pick out that morning, probably still unable to comprehend how his world had collapsed so completely. Claire, David's assistant, was arrested later that afternoon as investigators discovered she had been paid additional money to facilitate communications between David and Ms. Johnson while helping them cover their tracks. Her giggling amusement during my office visit now made perfect sense. She had been enjoying the drama of deception while profiting from it. The local business community reacted with shock and outrage as details of the pension fraud emerged. Silverwick Partners' stock price plummeted, and several major clients immediately terminated their contracts. The company that David had sacrificed our marriage to advance in was now facing potential bankruptcy due to the crimes he had helped commit. The trial proceedings stretched over 8 months, during which the full scope of David and Ms. Johnson's criminal conspiracy became public record. Federal prosecutors, armed with the comprehensive evidence I had provided, rejected all plea bargain attempts and pursued maximum sentences. Ms. Johnson received 10 years in federal prison and was ordered to pay $2.1 million in restitution to affected employees. Her professional licenses were permanently revoked, and her personal assets were seized to compensate victims. The judge specifically noted that, as a senior executive, she had betrayed the fundamental trust that employees place in their leadership. David was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison for conspiracy and aiding and embezzlement. Despite his attorney's arguments about manipulation and coercion, the judge emphasized that David's education and professional background made his crimes particularly inexcusable. Like Ms. Johnson, he lost all professional certifications and faced complete financial ruin. The personal consequences were equally devastating. Ms. Johnson's teenage children, who had been living with their father since her divorce, publicly disowned her after learning about her crimes. Her reputation in Phoenix's business community was permanently destroyed, with her case becoming a cautionary tale taught in corporate ethics courses. David's family cut all contact with him after the affair, and embezzlement became public knowledge. His parents, who had always been proud of his corporate success, refused to visit him in prison or provide any financial support. His professional network evaporated as former colleagues distanced themselves from the scandal. The FBI investigation revealed that David and Ms. Johnson had been planning to flee the country with the remaining pension funds, having already established offshore accounts and obtained false documentation. Their arrest prevented what could have been the complete destruction of dozens of families' retirement security. The employees of Silverwick Partners, supported by their recovered pension funds and a successful class action lawsuit, eventually found new employment as the company restructured under federal oversight. David and Ms. Johnson emerged from federal prison to find themselves unemployable pariahs in the business world, their criminal records ensuring that their betrayal of trust would follow them for the rest of their lives. The pension funds they had stolen were fully restored with interest, but their own financial futures remained permanently destroyed by their choices. Ms. Johnson lost custody of her children permanently and struggled to find even basic employment, while David discovered that no company would hire a convicted embezzler, regardless of his education or experience. As I reflected on the journey from that devastating moment in the conference room to watching justice served in federal court, I realized that exposing their crimes had protected innocent people while ensuring that corporate fraud faced serious consequences. The betrayal that shattered my marriage ultimately led to justice for everyone they had wronged, and I found peace knowing that their greed and deception had become the instruments of their own destruction.